But we start with this, the story affecting you this afternoon. It seems that Google applications have been down for several hours today around the world. There seems to have been problems, particularly with Gmail. We're joined now by Arthur Goldstuck from the consultancy Worldwide Worx. Arthur, good afternoon to you. Is it possible to know at this stage what caused this outage?
Good afternoon, Stephen. I don't think Google themselves quite know what caused it, but there's usually one of two answers. The one is that there's been a massive cyber attack, what they call a distributed denial of service attack, when millions of computers around the world are taken over remotely and simultaneously launch requests for access to all kinds of services on a particular site. So that can bring down a website. CNN has been brought down in the past by such an attack, but it's unlikely that Google would be brought down by that kind of attack. So the more likely answer is that there was some misconfiguration of their own systems. So, for example, internally they claimed that they were still operating, that all their systems were still working, but externally, every one of their major services went down. And to give you a sense of just how widespread that was, aside from Gmail itself, it included Google Calendar, so people couldn't access their schedules. It included Google Drive, so people couldn't access their files or any of the content they've stored. Google Docs, which means that if you use Docs instead of Microsoft Word, you couldn't even work on Google Docs. And then a range of other services as well. Around 20 major Google services were completely inaccessible for a little while. And Google themselves said they'll only give an update later today on what caused it.
I mean, if you look at the size of Google, one of the, really the biggest company in this sphere, you would like to, Apple I realize is big, but that's slightly different. You would like to think that Google would get it right. We've come to rely on Google, rightly or wrongly. It shows that even the big people get it wrong from time to time.
There's a common piece of wisdom in storing your data online or conducting your activities online, which is never to rely on one provider, as much as they tell you that they're the best in the world. So recently, Amazon Web Services, for example, went down. They are the biggest cloud computing in the world. The second biggest is Microsoft with their Azure data centers. They've also gone down. So every one of those has gone down from time to time. So the real lesson is that you don't keep your eggs in one basket.
It's easy to say that now. There'll be some people who are looking at a piece of some cracked eggs and wondering what on earth they're going to do. It would seem unlikely that any data goes missing during this time, right? That doesn't seem to happen.
No, that certainly won't happen in this kind of outage. It simply means you can't access the services, but they're still there. They're just waiting to be fired up again. And as people would have discovered, as the services came back online, it was as if nothing had ever happened, except for those who are dependent on their services being connected every nanosecond.
What does this do to the image of Google? This is quite a competitive space. Some of these apps, I realize they compete with Apple. Some of those Apple apps are free. So, for example, you can talk about Pages on an iPad or on a Mac service. You would talk about Google Documents, although Google Documents perhaps is easier when it comes to sharing. But in a competitive space, this isn't great for Google. Someone somewhere is getting shouted at very loudly.
There's no question. They always say heads are going to roll, but not in public. So someone is obviously going to pay a price for this. Google themselves are already paying a massive price because, for example, if you consider YouTube, how much revenue it generates from advertising, and their search service, how much that generates from advertising, every minute down is costing them millions of dollars.
I'm slightly surprised that all of these services all run together. There's no link really between Gmail and Google Documents, and yet clearly the back end, they are running off the same system.
I guess they are inextricably linked because the one depends on the other. So, for example, your Gmail account is linked to your Google Docs account and to your Google Drive account, and anything you generate in one is stored or reflected in the other. And the result is that they are linked in almost in the way that the organs of a body are linked, despite the fact that they're separate. And when one organ fails, the rest start failing as well.
You would like to think that, Google stands alone and competes against other people who stand alone who compete against Google. But am I right to think that maybe it's a bit more intertwined than that? I mean, would Google, for example, use Amazon Web Services?
They're probably not using them directly, but you do find that there are interlinkages between these services. So Amazon Web Services is a great example. When they go down, they take down a huge amount of sites and services around the world, which are also depending on the likes of Google for a redundancy, for backup, in other words. So when all of their services suddenly kick over to Google, that will put a massive demand on Google and potentially threaten the stability of the Google servers, and same with the Microsoft servers. So all of those are really dependent on each of the other functioning smoothly for their own smooth functioning.
You mentioned that you should back up on more than one service. Well, thanks, Arthur. Nice to know that now. But what is there to compete with Google? And I think in a way, I think many of us have become intertwined in the Google system. I didn't plan to. It just happened. You find that you just use this, which leads to that, which leads to that. Suddenly you're sort of hooked into the system. You depend on it without even knowing, and you don't really pay for it very much unless you're buying extra storage. Are there really good competitors out there?
For you and I, the typical services that you would be accessing are a Google Drive in terms of storing all our material there, or Microsoft OneDrive. So we, for example, use both of those services. Other organizations are using dedicated services on Amazon, for example. But generally speaking, the average consumer is using either Microsoft or Google for that kind of backup. And then Apple users tend to use iCloud as well, but that's quite expensive compared to the other two. Microsoft OneDrive gives you a vast storage space purely in return for you subscribing to their Office 365 service, for example. Google Drive is relatively inexpensive for storage. Apple iCloud is pretty costly. So we don't find too many consumers, especially in this part of the world, using iCloud as their general backup, or small businesses for that matter. Big businesses are going to typically use the dedicated services provided by the likes of Amazon Web Services and Microsoft.
Arthur Goldstuck, thanks very much indeed. My father is going to remind me that a pen and paper doesn't really get lost in the cloud. Thanks very much. Arthur Goldstuck from Worldwide Worx.